grab a blanket, grab a warm drink, and grab your favorite pair of headphones because it's time for another episode of the Vibebowl podcast. I'm your humble host Akash, and tonight we are talking about some of the most dominant players in any sport. Joining me tonight are 4 new guests and 1 returning guest. We have the inventor of sports himself, Jori.
What's up, guys? What's doing?
Nature Fact compiler, Joel.
Hello, Nature Fact with Joel on Instagram.
Mr. Worldwide himself, Thomas.
Hello.
Proud BlackBerry owner, Zach.
Proud's a strong word.
And returning guest, you might know him from last time, we have self-proclaimed flag enthusiast, Nevo.
Bonjour.
Before we get started, as usual, you can keep up with what we're talking about through the links in the description. There will be profiles and stats for all the sportsmen we talk about today, sportsmen and women. Make sure to check those out. And yeah, let's get started. So let's start with Jori. Who do you have for us today?
Well, let me put it this way. There's a lot of dominant athletes in, the history of athletics. You think of modern guys like Wayne Gretzky. He's got more assists than anyone else has points. You've got Serena Williams, the legendary career that she's put together. But, no one tops the absolute dominance of none other than Barry Lamar Bonds. Famous, of course, from his home run record from Major League Baseball. Barry Bonds is unmatched, in my view, as far as sheer dominance goes. A remarkable player in his prime, of course, which came a lot later than a lot of other guys. He's got that home run record. Of course, he got the syringe, of course, but there's no doubt that this guy is unmatched in baseball lore as far as just sheer dominance. You look at his OPS. His OPS looks like his slugging percentage. His slugging percentage looks like his OPS. It's all black ink all over his baseball reference page. Just a remarkable player. And I mean, if you have 15 minutes on your hands, do yourself a favor and look up on YouTube if Barry Bonds played without a bat. Just one of the most gorgeous pieces of entertainment you will ever watch. This guy was unmatched as far as just the fear that he struck into opponents. And that's my pick for the most dominant athlete of all time. And we can get more into the stats and the controversies later, but without a doubt, just you can't name a player that struck more fear into his opponents than Barry Bonds.
Wow, that's a very raving review indeed. Just for the people at home who might not know, some of the stats you mentioned, OBS and slugging stats, what are those? Just if you could explain briefly.
For sure. So OBP is on base percentage. So the goal of the game to get on base. And then, of course, we've got slugging percentage, which is basically a weighted version of that. So doubles are worth more than singles, triples are worth more than doubles, and so forth. And then OPS would be on base plus slugging. So you look at Barry Bonds, for example, in his best season, he had a 1,400 on base plus slugging. For reference, amongst the league leaders in the last few seasons, you've got names like Mike Trout. He scratches the 950 mark. So the dominance of Barry Bonds, who did that, by the way, in one of the worst ballparks to hit home runs in, really just shows you how dominant he was and for how long he was dominant for.
That was going to be my next question. How long was he dominant for? How long was his sort of career?
Well, his career started in 1986. He's 21 years old. Came up, he struck it 100 times in his first major league season and never struck out that many times after that. And he only left baseball basically because he was a distraction and ended up with some lawsuits and stuff. But even in his last year as a major leaguer, led the league, got on base more than anyone else in the major leagues in his last year, which, by the way, was 20 years later in 2007. He was 42 at the time. He probably could have played until he was 55. Just the absolute cojones on this man, or maybe lack thereof. But again, we'll get to that whole separate issue perhaps later. Barry Bonds really just stands in a league of his own as far as dominance in his field.
Okay, yeah, wow. Seems like a pretty scary opponent to play against. Let's see, maybe Joel has someone scarier, Joel.
Well, Jori, you talk about this guy striking fear into his opponents, and I think maybe a good way to assess that is his nicknames. So Barry Bonds' nicknames. Number one, we got the asterisk. I'm terrified of punctuation, so that one really gets me. You look at my guy, my man, Aleksandr Karelin. His nicknames include the Experiment and the Russian King Kong. Now, I'm not sure. I might be more scared of a Russian King Kong. This man was huge. He was a Greco-Roman wrestler, and he was ridiculously good. So my man went undefeated from 1982 to 1987. And then he went undefeated again from 1987 to 2000. In his career, he had 887 wins and 2 losses. And what's more, both losses by 1 point. He's got 3 Olympic golds, which is the most owing any Greco-Roman wrestler, to be clear. Greco-Roman wrestling, a form of wrestling, it's obviously dates back to the Greco-Roman age, if you didn't know. And if you're talking about striking fear, I don't know. Barry Bonds can hit a home run off of me, and I don't get hurt by that. if Aleksandr Karelin came up to me and hit me with his famous reverse body lift, the Karelin lift, I would die. He could actually kill me. He picked up his opponents and slammed them into the ground. That's the way he played. This man was dominant beyond all else. Ridiculous fighter, ridiculous wrestler, Aleksandr Karelin, Russian Greco-Roman wrestler.
Yeah, death is indeed pretty scary. I'm kind of saying. So he was a Greco-Roman wrestler, and he had a bunch of Olympic titles and stuff, right? And obviously, he probably fought a lot of things. Did he fight internationally, like outside of the Olympics? Did he go to other places and fight wrestlers from other countries and stuff?
I mean, he competed in the World Championships. He had 9 World Championships over the course of his career.
Oh, okay.
He also competed in World Cups. He had 2 World Cup Championships and 12 European Championships.
Oh, wow, yeah. How long was he a wrestler, actually? How long was this?
So he began his training to wrestle in 1981 when he was still fairly young. He was born in 67, so he was, fairly young in 81.
Mm-hmm.
He wrestled from when we have it tracked. I mean, they don't track as like coming up as being a kid and whatever.
Right.
But the early 1980s until the year 2000 was the stretch of his career.
Oh wow, yeah. So 20 years almost.
Yeah, a long time. 1982 to 2000.
Well, I'm sure he was probably beat, right? Was he ever beat towards the end?
He was beat twice in his entire career.
Oh, wow.
He only ever lost 2 matches. He had his first loss in 1987, and his last loss was his final match in 2000.
Oh, okay. So did he retire after that, or?
He did. So he lost 0-1 to Rulon Gardner of the U.S. in the Sydney Olympics in 2000,
mm-hmm.
and after that he retired.
Okay, so he was towards the end of his career, anyways, and then that was the signal almost.
Yeah.
Wow, only 2 losses. That's yikes. Well, that's pretty good as far as dominance goes. But Nevo, do you have anything better for us?
Okay, so everybody's coming up with these obscure names. I honestly haven't heard of either ones that have been mentioned so far. That being said, that doesn't make it an illegitimate candidate or anything. I'm just kind of going based part of what makes somebody the best is how many people can recognize them. I'm not coming in here with stats. I'm not coming in here as prepared as some of the picks given today. That being said, I do think that most of the sports that I watch and know about are more team-based sports. now obviously when you're part of a team, it's very hard to like stand out as the best, because part of winning as a team is, you know, working as a team.
Right.
That being said, there is like a sport I do think that like it gives like people a chance to like separate themselves, and like actually like leave a mark as like, you know, the best athlete per se. And I like, people can disagree with me, but I generally think like basketball, like specifically in the NBA, it's very easy for people to like it's very easy for like one player to have a huge impact. And you can see this based on the fact that like just this year, you have a team like the Los Angeles Lakers going from last place up to first place simply by adding 2 huge stars and a few more. Obviously, they did make a bunch of signings, but like to go from last to like first that fast is something that doesn't typically happen in other sports as opposed to like basketball. Considering that usually it's only 5 players on the field and like 1 player can just keep shooting. That's not to devalue like the worth of basketball players, but that being said, like I do think that as like easy of a pick as this tends to be, I do think Michael Jordan is a pretty good candidate for like the most like dominant athlete in the field. But actually until recently I would have easily said Jordan, but like I think LeBron James has made a pretty good contention for that title too. So I'm not going to come in here with like a bunch of stats, because like again I didn't necessarily look into it as hard as someone else. But I do think Jordan is like my top pick with like James right there. Simply due to like the amount of championships they've gotten each, and like how like they're able to like, especially like James, like every team he steps on just gets into the playoffs.
Okay, so you're saying LeBron James or Michael Jordan?
If we can only name one, I think like me being biased is still going to say Jordan, because I refuse to believe anybody is ever as good as Jordan.
Okay.
But I do think that James has made a legitimate like contention, so I'll go with Jordan.
I see. Yeah. So you're sort of thinking of dominance as this like force that everyone sort of knows of and sort of fears.
Yeah.
Right. Like this almost celebrity status as a force of dominance in a sport.
Yeah.
And I do agree. Individuals can, you know, sort of outshine their team a lot of times in basketball. Do you think Michael Jordan? Why do you think Michael Jordan was so sort of popularly dominant? He was such a huge figure in not just basketball, but outside of it too. What do you think? Where do you think his sort of this media dominance almost comes from?
I mean, people could correct me if I'm wrong, but how many didn't he win like 4 championships or something? 6. Yeah. So like
6-0.
And so he didn't even lose the championship. So like, yeah, and then I think like once he left the Bulls, they just like lost everything, right? So yeah, that's generally my like an easier like explanation for me, because I've actually seen it happen, is like LeBron James. He was on the Heat and then he left and then they stopped being good. He was on the Cavaliers and then he left and they stopped being good, came back and they were good again, and then left and they were bad again. Like players making that big of an impact just by moving to a team is to me like what shows how dominant a player is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see. So you're saying that they were players so dominant in their own right that that they could carry entire teams, like trashy or like not so great teams. They could carry them to championship wins just almost overnight, just by being there as, you know, one player, even though it's a team sport. So okay. Yeah, no, that's definitely an impressive feat to carry more than just your own performance, but a performance of like 4 other people in basketball. Thomas, you think you have a better sports player in mind?
Well, I went for, I guess you could say, a controversial choice, because he's still playing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't have necessarily the best stats, but I believe he will.
A rising star.
A star in the peak of his career.
Oh, okay.
And he's he's shown what he's really good at, and I think he will beat the best person in his sport. And I'm talking about Lewis Hamilton in F1. So in F1, Michael Schumacher, before Hamilton joined, Schumacher was seen as the best racer, up there with Ayrton Senna and Jim Clark as like really good drivers. But when Lewis Hamilton joined, he's currently 1 win behind Michael Schumacher, and is about 40 races. And Michael Schumacher has been in 40 more races than Hamilton. So Hamilton actually has a bigger win percentage than Schumacher.
Oh, okay.
So like, right? So like, he gets one more win. He's doing better than Schumacher. He's tied to Schumacher. He wins another one. He's doing better. Another important thing to look at is also poles. So right in F1, you start off with your practice laps and then your qualifying lap to see where you are on the grid. And so that usually shows right like you're qualifying your pace when you just can drive, and that's just overall skill with your car, not with outside interference and competition. That's just how good are you at driving with your car. And so Hamilton is one of the best qualifying drivers, where Schumacher had 68 pole positions. Lewis Hamilton has 96. That's like 37%. 37% of the time he gets pole position in his races, which is far better than Schumacher. The few drivers that have gone better percentages for pole position are Ayrton Senna and Jim Clark. The reason they haven't raced so much is that they died during racing. Yeah. So Hamilton's 96 pole positions are really good, and I do believe he'll continue to increase the amount of pole positions he gets in F1. And that's why I think he's one of the best athletes ever.
Okay, yeah. As soon as you mentioned F1, I thought of Michael Schumacher, right? He's the big celebrity of F1, but yeah, the fact that this man in the middle of his career, I'm assuming. How long has he been racing?
So he's been racing since 2007. He's 33, which is kind of mid-late career. Currently, Kimi Räikkönen is the oldest racer that's currently racing in F1, and he's 40.
Kimi Räikkönen's the Finnish dude, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's hilarious.
So yeah, I'd say he has about, like, if he wanted to keep driving, he'd probably keep driving for another 7 to 10 years. But like, he might eventually want to retire in a few seasons, but yeah, he's definitely got a while to go.
Oh, okay, yeah. So he's easily got another half a decade, and he's already on par with, greats like Michael Schumacher.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know much about F1, but like I have heard about Lewis Hamilton, and like all I know is that like I see people who are like tired of him winning all the time.
Exactly.
So I think that says a lot.
That's quite the reputation, yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a joke in F1 where it's like anyone but Mercedes, anyone but Hamilton should win.
Yeah, that's the joke I've seen.
Yeah, like people really like Max Verstappen just because like he has been able to beat Lewis Hamilton within the past few years, where he's like one of the few that can. Like Lewis Hamilton is now that new standard, that new bar that you have to beat if you want to even be considered.
Wow, yeah, being a meme in the current climate of a sport is, as we all know, probably the best indicator of dominance, right? But I don't know, maybe Zach has something else to say about that. Zach?
I mean, if you want to talk about memes, we've been talking about people that do damage with the bat, with the ball, with their bare hands, and with a car. But the one that we haven't really talked about is people that do damage with the racket. And of course, I'm talking about the legendary squash legend, Heather McKay. Now, Heather played squash throughout the 60s and 70s. She also played field hockey. She also played racquetball. During that time, in the British Open, which was the de facto world championship at the time, She didn't lose in a single British Open she played. A total of 16 British Open titles. And in the 2 World Opens that she played in, she won both of them in 1976 and 1979. After playing in 17 British Opens in 1977, she essentially stopped playing under the understanding that there was nobody who could really beat her. She came back for the World Open in 1979, won again, and essentially moved on to coaching and other avenues. But honestly, winning every game except for 2, every match, I should say, in her entire career, only losing 10 sets over the course of thousands. It's really a marvel to behold. Like Joel's pick, only ever losing 2 matches, but unlike Joel's pick, not having the longevity, unlike Jori's pick, not having the clustering, unlike Thomas's pick, not having the beneficiary of a potentially dominant car. All of these things that just make Heather McKay by herself stand alone, so dominant, singularity, not indecipherable or partially attributable to other people, just to her dominance and her dominance alone.
That is quite the account. Just curious, how long was she a squash player? How long was
So
this dominant career?
she started playing in 1960. She lost 1 game in 60 and 1 game in 62, not playing in the Opens in either of those years. In 1960. And then from 1962 to 1977, she played in the British Open, but she continued to play all the way until 1980.
Oh, wow. So, almost
so that's
18 years?
a total of 18-year career, only losing twice. I know that squash might not get the same coverage that sports like soccer or cricket or American football get, but
or Greco-Roman wrestling, right?
Oh, Greco-Roman wrestling, yeah.
I was going for the more high-profile sports, but Greco-Roman wrestling deserves its due as well, and obviously Karelin is a tremendous athlete in the way that he dominated Greco-Roman wrestling. But a silver to me at the World Championships puts Karelin slightly out of that entirely unattainable category. Somebody eventually caught Karelin. No one ever caught Heather McKay.
Okay, so no one, no one's come close to her.
Not in a British Open or in a World Open. So not in either of the 2 dominant championships, and not at any point in her career before winning her first British Open in 1962.
Wow, an 18-year streak of dominance. That's probably longer than some athletes' entire careers.
It really is a marvel to behold.
Well, that's everyone with their picks. I know Zach mentioned some of the other picks, so I'll open up the floor. Why do you think your pick is more dominant than any of the others?
Well, if I'm allowed to jump in here, I think there's a really interesting comparison here between Karelin and Heather McKay. McKay or McKay, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. They both had 18-year careers. They both only lost 2 games. So I want to look at those games they lost, right? Because those are maybe the ones that matter. Okay, so in Greco-Roman wrestling, I'll just briefly talk about the scoring system. Typical matches are maybe anywhere between 0 and 10 points for either wrestler. There's outliers either way, but fairly low scoring as far as points go. You'll see a lot of 3-0, 4-0 sort of wins by Karelin. I think it's important to realize that a lot of his wins came when the opponent scored 0 points. So he wasn't letting up a lot of ground there. And yes, I know Heather McKay had a lot more games played, but that's sort of the nature of the sport, not really in the hands of the athlete. And same with longevity of career. One could argue that having a long career in a sport where you get consistently thrown on a mat, well, some people do, Karelin didn't, when you're constantly taking actual physical abuse, avoiding injury might be a little more difficult than squash. I'm not saying squash is not a physically demanding sport. It absolutely is.
Mhm.
But I want to look at those losses, right? Look at the losses. Each time Karelin lost, it was by 1 point. It was by 1 point. Now, if we look at McKay, right? We look at the 1962 Scottish Open final. Yeah, I'm diving that deep. This was into the part of her career where she's playing in the Opens, and she's supposed to be this dominant athlete. What happened in the 1962 Scottish Open final? Could you tell me, Zach?
Give me a moment to start.
I'll fill you in. I'll fill you in. McKay lost in straight games.
Oh, that's not
She
good.
did not dominate that game. This was in the part of her career where she's supposed to be good, and she got dominated in that game. Karelin, despite the fact he eventually got overtaken, I'll admit that. In one match, there's not a single match you can point to, and you say Karelin got dominated in that match. Even when he lost, it's by 1 point. Heather McKay got dominated in a game.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. I think that dominated is a little bit just to fill in the viewers here who also don't want to Google the 1962 Scottish Open. When you say dominated, I assume that means straight sets, but do you know what the scores of those sets were?
I couldn't find them, to be honest
Okay.
with you. I tried to look it up, and I really tried, Zach.
Well, in squash, there over the course of time, there have been a variety of scoring systems employed, but during Heather McKay's era, it was mostly dealing on a hand-in, hand-out 9-point system, sometimes abbreviated as Hi-Ho 9. And what essentially happens in a Hi-Ho 9 system is that the server serves, and if they get a point, then get the point and retain the serve. And if they do not get the point, then the opponent gets serve. And so you're playing first person to 9. But you can only score points when you have serve, and you can only gain serve by scoring on a non-serve point. It's important to note that in between sets, like in these matches, Heather McKay is not starting with serve in each set. So if she's winning points and then getting the serve and then dominating on the serve and vice versa. I think another thing to point out here is you're saying 1 point, which is definitionally in wrestling the lowest denomination of point possible, and yet at the same time, even in the renowned matches that Karelin is playing in, he's only scoring himself 3 or 4 points in these dominant wins throughout the majority of his career. In some very early rounds, he will dominate with 10-point wins, 11-point wins. But I think that there is just a slight distinction to make that 1 point is while close, also in wrestling, not as close as otherwise perceived. I could be wrong about that. I also wanted to point out just an interesting point, because I don't really know much about F1. But I just wanted to ask Thomas a little bit about the evolution of the car and the role of the car in relation to the success of the driver, and whether Schumacher was also considered to be working with the best car while he was playing and while he was competing, and how much of the success of both of these people are attributable to the car itself.
Yeah, so you're asking about, like, were these drivers that I previously stated driving the best car at the time?
Well, yeah, I was just curious, like, how much of Lewis Hamilton's success is attributable to him and not the fact that he's driving the best car. If he is, I don't know if he is, and compared to people like Schumacher and the cars that they were driving relative to their fields.
That's really interesting to look at, because so Schumacher, for most of the height of his career, he was driving for Ferrari during a really good time of theirs. From around 1999 to 2004, for like a good 5-year period, Ferrari won the constructors race every year. In those years, so did Schumacher. Now, it should also be said, actually in 1989, he did not. He got 5th, but from 2000 to 2004, in that 5-year period, he did win with the Ferrari, beating out his teammate, Rubens Barrichello, who got 2nd place during those seasons. So, and then you all look at the other drivers. Ayrton Senna was driving for McLaren during a high point of their history, and Jim Clark drove for Lotus, who back in the 60s were considered a very good car company during F1 times. Like Hamilton driving a Mercedes now, I would say is similar to Schumacher driving a Ferrari or Senna driving McLaren. It should also be said that for a good 4 years at Mercedes, Hamilton had to drive the Mercedes with Nico Rosberg as his partner. And they had a very big competition between the two of them, where in 2016, Rosberg beat Hamilton after Hamilton beat him in the previous 2 seasons. So he does, so like that could bring in an argument like he wasn't the most dominant in 2016, but he is still more dominant in Nico Rosberg and total stats. Just had to falter that 1 year. So yes, while Hamilton does have the ability of driving Mercedes, there are other good cars on the track as well. Back in 2017, Ferrari had a car that could rival Mercedes, and they were actually keeping on par with Hamilton for the beginning of 2017. But then Hamilton later pulled away because Ferrari at that point did have the better car, but Hamilton was the better driver, more consistent driver, and was able to lead Mercedes to a victory that year.
You know, there's someone in here that's been awfully quiet, and I'd like to maybe address that. You know, Nevo, you haven't really taken a lot of heat, but I'd like to maybe raise some questions about Michael Jeffrey Jordan, as Skip so famously calls him. Skip, maybe someone.
Are you referencing Skip Bayless?
I am referencing Skip Bayless.
Are you actually going to reference
-5 points?
Oh my god, yeah.
Just thought. No,
the guy who called out a dude talking
make-
about that he's depressed and saying that's irresponsible.
I was just making a passing reference to how he refers to him. Now, if I may, I don't have the stats in front of me, but if I do recall correctly, Michael Jordan debuted in 1985. I want to say, maybe it was drafted in 1984. How long did it take him to get to his first NBA championship?
Good question. I'm scrolling through the info now. You want to tell me, Jori? I'm sure you're dying to tell me.
I actually did not pull that up. I should have been more prepared, but I definitely.
I mean, to be fair, this is who I'm supposed to be defending.
I believe it was 1992.
Oh,
so
really?
Zach out here.
7 years, right? At least 7 years.
Okay.
I believe that's 7 years. I think that's 7 years, maybe 8. If we go back to your other comparison, you know, LeBron James drafted in 2003, made it to the NBA Finals in 2007. So, you know, wasn't even the fastest phenom to make it to the NBA Finals in his, you know, career. And if I remember correctly as well, there's another certain aspect of that that's really interesting, is that Michael Jordan, even though he was 6-0 in the finals, did a lot of losing in the first, second, and third round, or maybe just there were 2 rounds at the time, I believe. Excuse me. So he did a lot of losing before he finally broke through. So while he is 6-0, he has less finals appearances than the aforementioned LeBron James.
If you want, I can switch my pick because, like, as I said, like for the longest time,
I'm not asking you to switch your pick because.
Well, hold on. Like comparing these two to each other is kind of pointless because I'm arguing that either of them is my pick for most dominance. So, like, Okay, then I'll go with LeBron James. I mean, the dude has appeared in how many finals? Like 10 or something? No, not 10, but like 9 or something. I'll actually look it up just so I'm not splurting out random stuff. Yeah, so bringing the point, I'm by the way, I'm 100% switching my pick right now just because I actually didn't consider how
The
dominant.
cowardice.
No,
I
not to
think-
do with cowardice.
Okay,
Listen,
okay,
I'm
I'll-
arguing for the most dominant player being from basketball.
I
And
think
as I said, I think these two are like pretty much like super close to each other.
yeah,
and like I
I'll allow Nevo to switch his
Yeah.
pick because he, according to like the criteria he set for himself, with the celebrity status and sort of almost media dominance through this sport, I'll let him switch his pick to LeBron James.
I mean, not even like the media status, like the fact that the dude has appeared in 8 straight NBA finals, 10 total, but like 8 straight finals of seeing this guy in the finals, and like he switched teams, so like whatever team he was on was the one that made it in. So I think that fact alone is like a pretty big like thing to consider when looking at like who's dominating the sport. Probably the guy that's in the finals every freaking year. So, and like you see it like the moment he leaves a team, it just tanks to the bottom. So like I think that's a pretty big stat for that. So you want to attack Jordan for not springing into it immediately.
Well,
Fine.
I actually want to jump back to LeBron because I think
Go for it.
there's actually a really interesting parallel with the two of them. Is that less so for LeBron because early in his career when he was losing in the finals, he was able to do it without help. But Jordan really only got going once he got his partner in crime, the Batman to his Robin, of course referring to Scottie Pippen. And in the case of LeBron, he had all sorts of help too with the Miami Heat. Obviously, you had Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh, and then back with the Cavaliers, he was playing with Kyrie Irving, who, for as much as an absolute bonehead he is widely regarded as one of the greatest ball handlers, phrasing, of a generation. So to me, and then obviously now, last year, without help, LeBron misses the playoffs, then brings in Anthony Davis after basically trading the entire future of the LA Lakers. Of course, it looks pretty good now. They're on the precipice of winning their first championship since Kobe Bryant was an LA Laker, but these guys always needed help. They couldn't do it on their own.
Well, at the end of the day, I do think basketball is like, it is still a team sport, right? You're working with other players. But like to me, like, yeah, and like especially on the Cavaliers, like, yeah, you had Kyrie Irving, but Kyrie Irving faced so many injuries. I think there were several finals where he like didn't play with Kyrie Irving. All he had was the likes of like J.R. Smith and Kevin Love. So like, but like even that, like the fact that the dude is able to like whatever team he's on is able to get into the finals, I think that's a pretty dominant way of like showing that you're dominating the sport. Yeah, one final quick point is also, I don't know much about baseball. I'm gonna need like Joel and Zach to like back me up on like attacking like your dude. What's his name? Bonds?
Barry Bonds.
Barry Bonds.
Barry Bonds.
Literally never heard of the man. I probably have heard of like the squash player before I heard of that guy.
Have you heard of the steroid scandal?
I have not. The only baseball scandal I know is Pete Rose.
Speaking of getting back to Barry Bonds, I want to talk about the man. So, I know that basketball and baseball are two very different sports. You don't have to lecture me about that. I know that an individual has more effect on a basketball game than a baseball game. Absolutely. You don't have to tell me that, Jori. But you just went after when Nevo was still back in Jordan. You went after Jordan for not having made the playoffs, not having made the finals until late in his career. And now I want to ask you a simple question, and I want a one number answer. How many times in his career did Barry Bonds make the World Series?
Once. He made it once with the
Oh,
San
so what the
Francisco
heck are
Giants
you comparing?
in
Exactly.
2002.
You're correct.
When
And how many
his
times
best
did
teammate,
Hey, Jori.
Jeff Kent.
Jeff Kent was an MVP. He was an absolute stud, one of the best second basemen of all time. So don't be roasting my man, Jeff Kent. Anyway, he never won a World Series, and I know he can't lead his team to a World Series by himself, and I know he hit well in that World Series. I'm not trying to attack that, but I'm saying you're not really comparing things fairly if you're attacking Jordan for not making the finals, but you're still going for Barry Bonds. But aside from that, Barry Bonds, he's a hitter. He's a hitter first. That's the only thing he was great at, especially late in his career. So we look at hitting stats, and we see that
Hold on. I'd actually like to jump in really quickly. hitting was not the only thing Barry Bonds did well, and this is actually really interesting. Barry Bonds is the only member of the 400-400 and 500-500 home run and stolen bases. This man was lethal on the base path, and we all know how you feel about stolen bases. For me, I'm not as big a fan, especially in the modern game. It has its place, but there's not much need to steal bases when you're busy, jogging around them anyways after you've hit another dinger. But the importance and the undervalue of the stolen base in recent years, at the time, stolen bases were not undervalued. Stolen bases were really considered an integral part of an elite player. You needed to be fast. You needed to be a power hitter. You needed to be able to field. And sure, Barry Bonds wasn't the best in the field, but that's not his calling card. His calling card was the fear that he struck into the opposing pitcher and the fear while on the base path. This man was like an international art thief, stealing bags left, right, and center.
So I'll argue one thing quick, and I want to finish this point, so don't jump in too quick, Jori. But he was never both of those things at the same time. In the time where he was an elite base stealer, he was not an elite power threat. He was a good power threat, but not the level you're talking about. And by the time he was an elite power threat, he was not an elite base stealer. And I'm just going to let the people decide why they think that might be. But what I want to bring up is you talk about the fear he strikes into batters, and you think, I know that you are a big fan of OPS, and maybe you'd like a stat like OPS plus, which takes into account park considerations and the run scoring and the league average. So we look at OPS plus, which is approximately, for people who don't know, it looks at your on-base plus slugging in relation to league average. In general, it's a decent way of looking, not a perfect way, but an okay way of looking at how productive a hitter was in comparison to league average, where league average is defined to be 100, and say if you had a 200 OPS plus, you'd be approximately 2 times as valuable as a normal hitter. Not a perfect stat, not a perfect explanation, but that's the gist of it. We see Babe Ruth has a significantly higher OPS plus than Barry Bonds. He was by far a more feared hitter in his time than Barry Bonds. I don't think there's a question about that. In Bonds' age, there were many people who could hit a lot of home runs. In Babe Ruth's age, there was very few other people. And then we also look at a guy named Ted Williams, who I would argue may be even more dominant than Bonds in his sport, because he has a higher career OPS plus. He has a higher career OPS plus. He's higher in some stats than Barry Bonds. And he missed 3 years of the prime of his career to go fight in the war. So you see that a guy who missed 3 years of his career manages to be a better hitter than Barry Bonds. And I don't think that really lines up as Barry Bonds being the best hitter of all time. And that's the thing he's known for. Barry Bonds was a decent defender in his time in Pittsburgh, and he was a good base stealer, but that's not why you think he's dominant. If you think he's dominant because of his base stealing, Rickey Henderson's the most dominant player in MLB history, but he's clearly not. Babe Ruth is a much more feared hitter than Barry Bonds. Ted Williams was a better hitter than Barry Bonds. Maybe even Ty Cobb was a better hitter than Barry Bonds.
Hey, Akash from the future here. So the sports discussion, unsurprisingly, went on for much longer than I expected, but I just couldn't bring myself to cut a lot of it, so I'll be splitting this episode up into 2 parts, and so this is part 1, and the second part will be coming out tomorrow. So stay tuned for that, and see you then.